You know, after more than 40 years on this bench, I've learned something important. It's not the big crimes that stay with me. It's the small cases, the ones where a fine might look small on paper, but feels impossible in real life. And one morning, a young father walked into my courtroom who reminded me why I still put on these robes every single day. But before I tell you this whole story, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, because what I'm about to share with you is something that needs to be heard. Trust me, you won't want to miss a single word of this. I've been a judge in Providence for over 40 years now. Every morning I wake up before the sun comes up. I make my coffee the same way I always have, strong, black, no sugar. My clerk, Christina, knows exactly how I like it, and somehow it's always waiting for me when I arrive. I've been married to my wife for decades, and she can usually tell just by the way I put on my tie whether it's going to be a heavy day or a light one. My father used to tell me something when I was young. He came to this country with nothing but hope and a strong work ethic. He said, "Frank, the law is powerful, but kindness is more powerful." I didn't fully understand that when I was young. I understand it now. That particular morning started like most mornings do. I arrived at the courthouse around 8:15, just like I've done thousands of times before. I walked down the hallway, nodded to the officers, and stepped into my courtroom. I could smell the coffee. I could hear the low hum of people talking quietly, life problems waiting to be called one by one. I sat down at my bench and started going through the case files. Parking tickets, registration issues, minor violations, the kinds of cases people on television like to joke about. But I've never laughed at them because I know behind every file is a person, a story, a life. As I flipped through the stack, one file caught my eye. Not because it was dramatic, not because it was serious. It was simple. Failure to pay fines, missed payment plan, nothing flashy. But something in my gut told me to pay attention. I remember thinking to myself, this isn't just about money. Christina greeted me like she always does. She smiled and asked if I was ready. I nodded. I always am. But I also felt something that morning, a kind of quiet tension, like the courtroom was holding its breath. The first few cases went quickly. A woman explained she forgot to renew her registration. A man admitted he parked where he shouldn't have. I listened. I asked questions. I made decisions. That's the job. But then Christina called the next name, and everything slowed down. I looked up and saw him walk in. I saw a young man standing there, shoulders slightly hunched, holding paperwork with both hands. I noticed his clothes right away. Clean, but worn. Shoes scuffed at the edges. The kind of look you get when you care, but you're tired, really tired. I could tell immediately he was nervous. I've seen that look thousands of times. He wasn't angry. He wasn't arrogant. He was scared. I asked him to step forward. I said it gently because tone matters in my courtroom. When he spoke, his voice was quiet but respectful. He called me Your Honor, and he meant it. I looked down at his file and then back at him. I asked him a simple question. I said, "Sir, do you know why you're here today?" He nodded. I saw his hands shake just a little. He told me he was behind on payments. He didn't make excuses. He didn't blame anyone else. He said, "I messed up, Your Honor. I'm trying to fix it." That honesty hit me right in the chest. I asked him how old he was. He told me, young, much younger than I was when I first sat on this bench. I asked him what he did for work. He hesitated for a second like he was embarrassed to say it. Then he told me he worked 2 jobs. I leaned forward when I heard that. I asked him to explain. He told me he worked construction during the day, early mornings, long hours. Then at night he worked at a warehouse, loading trucks, standing on concrete floors until his legs hurt. I could hear the exhaustion in his voice. I could almost feel it in my own body. I asked him why he was working so much. He swallowed hard before answering. Then he said something I'll never forget. He said, "I have a little girl at home, Your Honor. She's 3. I just want to make sure she has everything she needs." That sentence stopped the room. I felt my throat tighten. I thought about my own family. I thought about how many parents out there are doing everything right and still barely holding on. I asked him if the child's mother was involved. He said she was, but money was still tight. Rent, diapers, food, gas. Everything costs more now. I looked around my courtroom. Everyone was quiet. Even the people waiting for their own cases were listening now. They could feel it too. I asked him why he missed the payments. He didn't get defensive. He didn't get emotional. He just told the truth. He said some weeks it was either pay the fine or buy groceries, and groceries won. I took a deep breath. I had to. Because moments like this are exactly why being a judge isn't just about rules. It's about judgment, real judgment. I told him I appreciated his honesty. I told him I could see he was trying. I said something my father taught me a long time ago. I said, working hard matters, taking responsibility matters, and you're doing both. I could see his eyes start to water. He tried to hide it. Men like him often do. I explained the law to him. I told him what the fines were. I told him what could happen if things stayed the same. I also told him something else. I told him I believed in giving people hope when they earn it. I asked him one more question. I said, if I help you today, what will you do with that chance? He didn't hesitate. He said, I'll keep working. I'll keep paying. And one day, I want my daughter to be proud of me. That did it. I felt something shift inside me. I picked up my glasses, then set them back down. I looked him directly in the eyes. I wanted him to know I meant every word that came next. I told him I was going to lower his fine. I told him I was restructuring his payment plan so it fit his life, not destroyed it. I told him I didn't want this hanging over his head while he was trying to build a future. I said, sir, this court exists to correct behavior, not crush people who are already doing their best. He broke down, not loudly, not dramatically, just quiet tears, the kind that come when someone finally feels seen. I dismissed his case and I watched him walk away, standing a little straighter than when he walked in. That's a victory you don't see on TV. And as he left my courtroom, I remember thinking to myself, this is how justice is supposed to feel. But what I didn't know yet was that this wasn't even the most important moment of that day, not even close. After that young father left my courtroom, I sat there for a moment longer than usual. I watched the door close behind him. I've learned over the years that sometimes the quiet moments are the loudest ones. You can feel when you've done something right. You don't celebrate it. You just carry it with you. I took a sip of my coffee and looked down at the next file. But my mind wasn't fully on the paperwork yet. I kept thinking about that little girl he mentioned, 3 years old. Too young to understand struggle, but old enough to feel love. I thought about how close that man was to falling behind. Not because he didn't care, but because life can be unforgiving. That's the part people don't see. They see a missed payment. I see a human being trying to survive. I straightened the papers on my bench and nodded to Christina to call the next case. The courtroom came back to life. Footsteps echoed. Chairs shifted. A baby cried somewhere in the back. This place has a sound of its own. It's the sound of real life colliding with the law. Case after case moved along. Some were simple. Some needed explanation. I listened carefully to each one because every person deserves to be heard, even if they only have 2 minutes. I learned that early in my career. People don't always remember the outcome, but they always remember whether you listen. At one point, I removed my glasses and rubbed my eyes. I'm not ashamed to say it. Long days catch up with you. Christina noticed and asked quietly if I needed a break. I shook my head. I was fine. I wanted to keep going. Then I noticed something. I heard a sound that didn't belong. It was a laugh. Not a nervous laugh, not a relieved laugh. This one was sharp, dismissive. It cut through the room in a way that made me look up instantly. I scanned the gallery, and that's when I saw her for the first time. I saw a woman sitting in the back row, leaning back in her chair like she was at a cafe instead of a courtroom. I noticed her clothes right away. Expensive, perfectly fitted, designer handbag resting on the floor like it didn't belong on courthouse tile. I watched her glance at her phone. I watched her roll her eyes when another defendant struggled to explain himself. I remember thinking to myself, something about her tone doesn't sit right with me. I've been doing this long enough to trust my instincts. Christina leaned toward me and quietly said the name that was coming up next. I looked down at the file, then back at the woman. The name matched. This was her case. Before Christina even finished calling it, the woman stood up. She walked forward with confidence. Too much confidence. I've seen it before. People who think the law is something that happens to other people. I waited until she reached the podium. I didn't rush. I let the silence do its job. Then I looked at her and introduced myself the way I always do. Calm, respectful, firm. I asked her how she was doing today. She sighed, loudly. Then she said she was in a hurry. That was my first red flag. I asked her if she understood why she was here. She shrugged and said something about a stupid fine. I could feel the energy in the room change. People stopped whispering. They were watching now. I looked down at the charges. Failure to pay. Multiple notices ignored. Payment plan broken without communication. Nothing violent, nothing dramatic. But the attitude mattered. I asked her why she hadn't followed the plan she agreed to. She laughed again, that same laugh. She said she forgot. She said it wasn't a big deal. She said she could pay it if she really wanted to. I felt my jaw tighten. I told her this was a court of law, not a suggestion box. I told her when you agree to something with the court, your word matters. She crossed her arms and looked past me like I wasn't even there. That's when I noticed something else. She glanced over her shoulder and smirked at another defendant who had just been struggling to explain his situation. It was the same young father from earlier. He hadn't left the building yet. He was waiting on paperwork. I saw it clearly. The look said, "I'm not like him." That bothered me more than anything she had said. I took a breath. I had to remind myself to stay centered. I've always believed the bench should never become a stage for anger, but it also shouldn't tolerate disrespect. I asked her a direct question. I said, "Do you understand the seriousness of ignoring court orders?" She tilted her head and said something I'll never forget. She said, "Your Honor, I spend more on shoes than this fine." I heard a gasp from the gallery. I saw Christina close her eyes and shake her head slightly. I felt my blood pressure rise. "I'm not going to lie to you." I had to count to 10 in my head. I leaned forward so she could see my face clearly. I wanted her to understand that this moment mattered. I told her something I've said many times over the years. I said money can buy a lot of things, but it can't buy character, and it can't buy your way above the law. She smiled, actually smiled. That's when I knew this wasn't just a routine case. Now let me pause here for just a second. I need to ask you something. Have you ever met someone who thinks rules don't apply to them? Someone who believes money solves everything? Leave me a comment, because I actually read them. And if you're still with me, hit that like button for me. I looked back down at her file. That's when my gut started talking again. Something didn't add up. Missed payments weren't the real issue here. This was about attitude, about respect, or the lack of it. I asked her where she worked. She gave me the name of a company I recognized, a big one, a powerful one. I raised an eyebrow. I asked her position. She hesitated just a second too long before answering. I've learned to watch those pauses. I asked her income range. She laughed again and said it wasn't relevant. I told her it was very relevant. She rolled her eyes. I could feel the tension spreading across the room like electricity. I thought back to the young father. I thought about his shaking hands, his quiet voice, his honesty. The contrast was impossible to ignore. I said to her, "In my courtroom, a man working 2 jobs to feed his child stands on the same ground as you." And the law treats you exactly the same. That's when her smile faded. She opened her mouth to say something else, but before she could, something unexpected happened. I noticed a man stand up slowly in the gallery. He was wearing a suit, not flashy, government issue. I recognized that look immediately. He asked permission to speak. I looked at Christina. She handed me a sealed envelope that hadn't been in the file earlier. My heart rate picked up just a little. In 40 years, you learn when a moment is about to change direction. I held the envelope in my hands. I could feel the weight of it, not physically, emotionally. I remember thinking to myself, pay attention, Frank, this is important. I hadn't opened it yet. I hadn't read a single word, but I could feel it. Time seemed to slow down. The woman in front of me was still standing there, arms crossed, unaware that everything was about to change. And as I looked up from that envelope and back at her face, I realized something. The hope I gave that young father earlier that morning was about to be tested by someone who had never learned what hope really costs. I held that sealed envelope in my hands for a moment longer than necessary. I've learned that silence can do more than words ever could. The courtroom was completely still. I could hear the faint buzz of the lights above me. I could hear my own breathing. I looked up at the man who had stood in the gallery. I asked him to identify himself. He did so calmly. He told me he was an assistant U.S. attorney. That got everyone's attention. I saw heads turn. I saw the woman in front of me straighten up just a little. I asked him why he was here. He said he was observing. That was all he said at first, just observing. I nodded. I didn't push, but my instincts were fully awake now. When someone from the federal government says they're just observing, it usually means something more. I turned my attention back to the woman standing before me. I asked her again, calmly, if she understood the seriousness of her situation. She looked confident, almost bored. She said she didn't see what the big deal was. I removed my glasses and set them down carefully. I do that when I want someone to know I'm fully focused. I said to her, "This court exists to hold people accountable, not to be mocked." She sighed again. She said she didn't mean any disrespect, but her tone told a different story. Words matter, but tone matters more. I decided to ask her something simple. I asked her if she knew the purpose of a payment plan. She said it was for people who couldn't afford things up front. She said it like she was explaining something obvious to a child. I nodded. Then I said, "Exactly, it's a system built on trust, and when someone breaks that trust, it matters." She shrugged. I felt a familiar frustration rise in my chest. I felt it many times before, but I never let it control me. I reminded myself that my job wasn't to teach her humility. My job was to apply the law fairly. Still, I couldn't ignore the contrast in my own courtroom that morning. Just an hour earlier, I had looked into the eyes of a young father who carried the weight of the world on his shoulders. Now I was looking at someone who seemed untouched by consequence. I asked her one more question. I said, "Do you believe the rules apply to you?" She hesitated just for a second. Then she said, "Of course they do, but this is being blown out of proportion." That answer told me everything. I turned my attention back to the assistant U.S. attorney. I asked him if there was something I needed to know. He nodded. He asked if he could approach. I granted it. He handed Christina another document. Christina handed it to me. This time it wasn't sealed. I scanned it quickly. My heart skipped a beat. I looked up slowly. I asked the woman to state her full name for the record. She did. Her voice wasn't as confident now. I asked her employer again. She repeated it, this time more carefully. I asked her if she was aware of an ongoing investigation involving her department. Her face changed. I watched the color drain from her cheeks. It was subtle, but I've seen it before. The moment when someone realizes the ground beneath them isn't as solid as they thought. She said she didn't know what I was talking about. I took a deep breath. I had to, because what I was holding in my hands was no longer just about unpaid fines. It was about integrity, about honesty, about the law revealing itself layer by layer. I said to her, "Ma'am, you're here today for a minor matter, but sometimes minor matters bring major truths into the light." She swallowed hard. I could feel the entire courtroom leaning in. Even the officers near the doors were paying closer attention now. Time felt strange, like it was stretching and tightening at the same time. I asked the assistant U.S. attorney if he wished to make a statement. He said yes. He spoke calmly, professionally. He said there was an active federal investigation involving misuse of funds. He said certain names had surfaced, including hers. I watched her reaction carefully. Her hands started to shake, the same hands that had been so casual earlier, the same hands that had waved this court away like it was nothing. She looked at me and said, "Your Honor, this has nothing to do with today." I looked right back at her. I said, "You're right, and you're wrong. It has nothing to do with your fine, but it has everything to do with your attitude toward the law." I paused. I let that sink in. I told her something I've learned in 40 years. I said, people who respect the small rules usually respect the big ones, and people who laugh at small consequences often end up facing much larger ones. She started to cry, not softly, not quietly. This time it was panic, real panic. I felt a familiar sadness settle over me, not satisfaction, not anger, sadness, because I've seen this story before. Different faces, same ending. I thought again about the young father, about how he had asked for nothing except a chance. I thought about how justice isn't just about punishment. It's about proportion. I said to her, 2 hours ago, you laughed at a man who couldn't afford a fine. Now you're asking this court to take you seriously. Do you see the irony? She couldn't answer. I asked the assistant U.S. attorney if the woman was being taken into custody today. He said not yet, but he said charges were coming. The courtroom was silent again. I leaned back slightly in my chair. I felt tired, not physically, emotionally. This is the weight of the job. You don't just see people at their best. You see them at their most exposed. I addressed the woman one final time for the matter before me. I told her the fine would not be reduced. I told her the payment plan would stand. And I told her something else. I said, this court doesn't measure people by their bank accounts. It measures them by their behavior. And today, your behavior has spoken loudly. She nodded slowly, tears falling freely now. I dismissed her case. As she turned to leave, I noticed something small but powerful. Her designer handbag slipped from her shoulder and fell to the floor. Nobody rushed to pick it up, not even her. I watched her walk away, shoulders no longer back, head lowered, the confidence gone. I sat there for a long moment after she left. I removed my glasses again and rubbed my eyes. I thought about the contrast of that morning. Hope on one end, consequence on the other. And I realized something important. This day wasn't just about lowering a fine for a young father. It was about reminding everyone in that room that justice has a memory. And it doesn't forget how you treat people when you think no one important is watching. I took a deep breath and nodded to Christina. I said, call the next case. But deep down, I knew the most important lessons of that day had already been delivered. After I dismissed that case, I sat there quietly for a moment. I didn't rush to the next file. I rarely do when something heavy has just happened. I've learned that if you don't take a second to absorb moments like that, they pile up inside you, and eventually that weight finds a way out. I looked around my courtroom. People were sitting differently now, straighter, quieter, more aware. This room has a way of teaching lessons without saying a word. I picked up the next file, but my mind drifted back to the young father. I wondered if he had already left the building. I hoped he did. I hoped he went back to work feeling lighter than when he walked in. Sometimes hope is the most valuable thing a court can give. Christina called another case, a routine matter. I handled it the way I always do, calm, fair, focused. But underneath it all, something stayed with me. A comparison I couldn't shake. I thought about how differently people experience the same system. For one person, a fine is an inconvenience. For another, it's a crisis. The law doesn't always see that difference on paper, but a judge must see it in real life. That's why I've always believed judgment is not just about rules, it's about wisdom. As the morning went on, the courtroom filled and emptied again and again. Faces blurred together, stories overlapped. But the energy from earlier never fully left. I could still feel it in the air, like a low hum. At one point, Christina leaned toward me and quietly said the young father was still outside. He wanted to thank me before he left. I nodded. I asked her to let him come back in when there was a break. When he stepped back into my courtroom, I saw something different in him. His shoulders were more relaxed. His eyes were clearer. He looked like a man who could breathe again. He stood at a respectful distance. He didn't ask for anything else. He just said thank you. He told me I didn't just lower a fine. I gave him hope. He said he'd never forget that. I felt a lump form in my throat. I told him something simple. I said, "Keep doing what you're doing. Your daughter is watching you, even when you don't realize it." He nodded, then he left. I sat there thinking about that moment for a long time. I thought about how easy it is to underestimate the power of kindness, especially in a place like this. People expect punishment here. They don't expect understanding. And that's exactly why it matters. I've had people ask me over the years why I show compassion. They ask if it makes me soft. I always give the same answer. Compassion doesn't weaken the law, it strengthens it. Because when people feel seen, they're more likely to respect the rules. I thought back to my early days on the bench. I was younger then, more rigid. I thought being firm meant being cold. Experience taught me otherwise. Firmness and humanity can exist together. In fact, they should. I remembered something my father used to say to me before work. He'd say, "Frank, treat every person with dignity. You never know what battle they're fighting." That advice has never failed me. Now let me be honest with you for a moment. At this point in the day, I was feeling emotionally drained. Watching entitlement crumble is never satisfying the way people think it is. It's sobering. It reminds you how fragile arrogance really is. And I want to pause here and ask you something. Have you ever felt that frustration, watching someone disrespect something important while others struggle just to stay afloat? If you know what I'm talking about, hit that like button for me and make sure you're subscribed, because what happens next I never saw coming in my entire career. The rest of the day moved quickly. Everything happened so fast. Before I knew it, court was adjourned. I returned to my chambers, loosened my tie, and sat down heavily in my chair. That's when Christina knocked on the door. She told me the assistant U.S. attorney wanted to speak with me privately. I told her to send him in. He came in quietly and closed the door behind him. He thanked me for my time earlier. I told him I was just doing my job. He shook his head and said, "No, Your Honor, you did more than that." He sat across from me and explained what was really going on. He told me the investigation was bigger than I realized. Federal funds, misuse, cover-ups, people who thought they were untouchable. He told me the woman from earlier had been under scrutiny for months. He said her behavior in court was consistent with what they'd seen behind closed doors: disregard, arrogance, a belief that consequences were for other people. I listened carefully. I always do. He told me something that made my stomach turn. He said if she had shown even a hint of responsibility earlier, things might have unfolded differently. Cooperation matters, attitude matters, respect matters. I leaned back in my chair and let out a slow breath. I told him something I truly believe. I said, the courtroom reveals people, not because it's scary, but because it demands honesty. He nodded. After he left, I sat there alone for a long time. I looked at the wall. I thought about the two people from that morning, two lives, two attitudes, two outcomes moving in very different directions. And I realized something that still stays with me. Justice isn't loud. It doesn't always come with handcuffs or applause. Sometimes it comes quietly, in the form of a reduced fine, or a hard truth, or a moment of humility. That night when I went home, my wife asked me how my day was. She can always tell when something's weighing on me. I told her about the young father. I told her about the woman. I told her how close those moments were, yet how far apart they felt. She listened. Then she said something simple. She said, "That's why you still care after all these years." She was right. I went to bed thinking about that young girl, 3 years old. I hoped one day she'd understand what her father did for her, how he stood in a courtroom and chose responsibility over excuses. And I also thought about the other woman, about how life sometimes gives you small warnings before it delivers big consequences. I didn't know then how quickly those consequences would arrive, but I was about to find out. The next morning, I arrived at the courthouse the same way I always do. Same time, same walk down the hallway, same smell of coffee waiting for me. On the surface, nothing felt different, but inside, I had a feeling I couldn't shake. Something unfinished was still hanging in the air. I sat down at my bench and opened my files. Christina greeted me with her usual smile, but I could tell she was curious. People who work around courtrooms develop a sixth sense. They know when a case isn't over, even when it looks like it is. I hadn't even finished my first sip of coffee when Christina leaned in and quietly told me the assistant U.S. attorney was back in the building. That got my attention. I nodded and told her to let me know when he was ready to speak. I tried to focus on the cases in front of me, but my mind kept drifting. I remembered the woman's laughter. I remembered the way she looked at that young father. And I remembered the look on her face when the ground started to shift beneath her. Mid-morning, during a short break, Christina came to my chambers and told me the assistant U.S. attorney needed just a few minutes. I told her to send him in. When he walked in, his expression was different from the day before, more serious, more urgent. He didn't sit right away. He stood there for a moment and said, "Your Honor, things moved faster than we expected." I leaned forward. He told me that late the previous night, new evidence had come in, documents, emails, financial records. He said it tied directly to the woman from my courtroom. He said the investigation had reached a point of no return. I listened carefully as he explained. I won't get into every legal detail, but the truth was simple. She had abused her position. She had moved money where it didn't belong, and she had done it while believing she was untouchable. I felt a familiar heaviness settle in my chest. I asked him what was going to happen next. He told me federal charges were being prepared. He told me there would be an arrest. Soon. I sat back in my chair and removed my glasses. I rubbed my eyes slowly, not because I was tired, because I was thinking about how quickly arrogance can collapse. I thought about that laugh again, the one she let out in my courtroom, the one that said none of this matters. I thanked him for keeping me informed. When he left, I sat there quietly for a long time. I stared at the same spot on the wall where I've stared 1,000 times before after difficult moments. Some habits never change. Court resumed shortly after. The room filled again. Life continued. People brought their problems forward one by one. And then, just before lunch, something happened I'll never forget. I heard movement near the back of the courtroom. Not the usual shuffling. This was deliberate, purposeful. I looked up and saw 2 federal agents standing near the door. The room went silent almost instantly. They didn't rush. They didn't make a scene. They walked calmly toward the front. And then I saw her. I saw the woman from the day before sitting in the gallery. She wasn't confident anymore. She wasn't relaxed. She was rigid, her hands clenched in her lap. I felt time slow down. I watched as the agents approached her. I watched as one of them spoke quietly. I couldn't hear the words, but I didn't need to. I saw her face collapse. I saw fear replace arrogance in a heartbeat. I heard the soft click of handcuffs. That sound stays with you. I've heard it many times in my career, but this time it felt different, because less than 24 hours earlier she had laughed at the law, and now the law was standing right in front of her. I watched her stand up slowly. Her designer handbag slipped from her shoulder and hit the floor again. This time, the sound echoed. Nobody moved to pick it up. I thought about the young father. I thought about how carefully he had held his paperwork, how nervous he was, how grateful. The contrast was painful. I felt something well up inside me, not satisfaction, not triumph, sadness, because no one wakes up planning to end their day in handcuffs. People drift there, one decision at a time. The agents led her toward the door. She glanced up at me as she passed. For the first time, there was no defiance in her eyes, just fear and maybe regret. I nodded slightly, not in judgment, not in mercy, just acknowledgement. After they left, the courtroom remained silent. Even the people waiting for their cases didn't speak. Everyone had just witnessed something real, something raw. I took a deep breath and addressed the room. I said, "Let me tell you something I've learned in 40 years. The law is patient, but it always catches up. And how you treat people when you think it doesn't matter says everything about who you are." I let that settle. Then I continued court. That afternoon, after court adjourned, I went back to my chambers. I sat down slowly. I felt older than usual. Days like that do that to you. Christina knocked softly and asked if I was okay. I told her I was. I just needed a minute. I thought about justice, about how it can show up in different forms. For one man, it was compassion. For another woman, it was consequence. And I realized something important. The law didn't favor one over the other. It responded to who they chose to be. That night, when I went home, I couldn't stop thinking about the sound of those handcuffs. And I couldn't stop thinking about the quiet thank you from that young father. Both moments were justice, just wearing different faces. In the weeks that followed, life in my courtroom returned to its usual rhythm. New faces, new problems, same bench, same responsibility. But I would be lying if I said that day didn't stay with me. Some cases fade quickly. Others settle into you and refuse to leave. I kept thinking about the young father. I wondered how he was doing, whether the new payment plan was helping, whether he was getting a little more sleep at night. Judges aren't supposed to follow cases after they end, but we're human. We wonder. I also thought about the woman who had been arrested, not with anger, with curiosity. I wondered if she ever thought back to that moment in my courtroom, the moment she laughed, the moment she believed she was untouchable. A few weeks later, during a quiet afternoon, Christina came into my chambers holding an envelope. She told me it had come through official channels. It was addressed to me personally. I took the envelope and looked at it for a moment. I didn't recognize the handwriting at first. Then I noticed the return address. It was from a federal detention facility. I felt my chest tighten. I sat down slowly and opened it. Inside was a letter, written neatly, carefully, like someone who had plenty of time to think. It was from her. I almost didn't read it. I've received many letters over the years, some angry, some grateful, some confused, but something told me this one mattered. She started by addressing me respectfully. No sarcasm, no entitlement. She told me she was writing to apologize, not just for what she did, but for how she behaved. She said she had never been told no before. She said she grew up believing money fixed mistakes. She admitted that sitting in my courtroom was the first time she felt truly exposed. I paused while reading. I had to. She wrote about the moment she laughed. She said she remembered seeing the young father. She said she remembered thinking she was better than him. And then she wrote something that caught me completely off guard. She said, "That man was richer than I ever was. He had integrity." I felt a lump in my throat. She wrote that being arrested in front of strangers was humiliating. But sitting in that courtroom the day before, watching someone with nothing show more dignity than she ever had, hurt more. She said jail was quiet, too quiet, and that silence forced her to think about who she really was. She ended the letter by thanking me, not for being kind, but for being fair. I sat there holding that letter for a long time. I didn't move. I didn't speak. I just let it sink in. I thought about my father again. He used to tell me that the law is a mirror. It doesn't change you. It shows you. That letter was proof of that. A few days later, something else happened that reminded me why this work matters. Christina came into my chambers with a smile. She told me someone was asking for me at the front desk. It was the young father. I told her to bring him in. When he walked in, I barely recognized him at first, not because he looked different, but because he carried himself differently. He stood taller. He smiled more easily. He told me the new payment plan had changed everything. He said he was finally catching up. He said he had started saving a little, not much, but something. He told me his daughter had started preschool. He said watching her walk into that classroom felt like a victory. I felt my eyes burn. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He said it was a drawing. His daughter had made it. It was crayon scribbles and stick figures. He said he told her he met someone who helped him. I didn't know what to say. I thanked him for sharing that with me. I told him something I believed deeply. I said, "You didn't succeed because of me. You succeeded because you refused to quit." He shook my hand before he left. A firm handshake, a grateful one. After he walked out, I sat alone again. I thought about how close those two lives had crossed paths in my courtroom. One learned humility through kindness, the other through consequence. And I realized something. Justice isn't about choosing sides. It's about responding to character. I've learned over 40 years that when people take responsibility, the law should make room for mercy. And when people mock responsibility, the law must stand firm. That balances everything. I've been asked many times how I stay hopeful after seeing so much struggle. This is how. Moments like these, when you see that dignity still exists, that people can change, that effort matters. I folded the letter carefully and placed it in my drawer, not as a reminder of wrongdoing, but as a reminder of growth. As I prepared to leave that day, I looked around my empty courtroom. The benches were silent, the lights dimmed, but the lessons were loud, and I knew one thing for certain. The story wasn't over yet. I think about that day more often than people might expect. After 40 years on this bench, days usually blend together, but some moments stay sharp, clear. They follow you home. They sit with you in the quiet. That day reminded me why my father came to this country. He didn't come for comfort. He came for fairness. He believed that if you worked hard and treated people right, the system would meet you halfway. Not always kindly, but honestly. I've carried that belief with me every morning I've walked into this courtroom. Weeks after I received that letter, I learned more about what happened next. The federal case moved forward. The investigation uncovered millions of dollars misused. Programs meant to help struggling families had been drained by people who already had more than enough. I sat in my chambers when I heard that and shook my head slowly. I thought about how close I came to treating that woman's case like just another unpaid fine. I thought about how often the truth hides behind small moments. That's something people don't realize. Big consequences often reveal themselves during small decisions. Not long after that, I received another update. Some of the recovered funds were being redirected. Scholarships, community support, child care assistance. The money was finally going where it was supposed to go. And then I heard something that brought tears to my eyes. One of the first families approved for help was the young father's. His daughter received a scholarship for early childhood education. Nothing extravagant, just support, just a little less weight on a hard-working family's shoulders. I leaned back in my chair when I heard that. I removed my glasses and rubbed my eyes. I thought about that crayon drawing he showed me, about how a small act of fairness had rippled outward in ways I could never have planned. That's justice when it works. A few months later, I saw him again, not in court, in public, at a local event. He waved. His daughter ran ahead of him, laughing. He looked at me and nodded. No words needed. That moment meant more to me than any headline ever could. Now let me ask you something honestly. Do you think I was too lenient on him? Or do you think justice sometimes means understanding context, not just enforcing penalties? I'm genuinely curious what you think. And here's another question for you. If you were sitting where I sit, wearing these robes, what would you have done? Would you have shown mercy, or would you have delivered punishment without flexibility? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. I actually read them, every single one. You know what keeps me doing this job after all these years? It's not the authority. It's not the title. It's moments like these, when you see that the law really can lift people up when it's applied with wisdom. If this story meant something to you, if you believe in equal justice the way I do me a favor. Hit that like button and subscribe to this channel. Turn on that bell icon so you never miss another story from my courtroom. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it, someone who might be struggling, someone who might think they're invisible, someone who needs to be reminded that character still matters more than cash. And check out the next video on your screen. I've got another incredible story from my courtroom that you won't believe. I'll see you tomorrow with another lesson about justice, respect, and what really matters in this life. I'm Frank Caprio. I've been on this bench for 40 years because I believe something simple. We're all equal before the law, every single one of us, rich or poor, powerful or powerless. That's what makes this country work. Thank you for listening to my story. God bless you. And remember this, respect costs nothing, but it's worth everything.